Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Islamabad Policy Institute, I warmly welcome you all to today's lecture titled Iran's Foreign Policy Outlook Under New Administration. The lecture is organized in the backdrop of new Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi's oath ceremony taking place today. I am grateful to all the intellectuals, academicians, and scholars who have spared time for the lecture and joined us here. The lecture will be delivered by our guest speaker, Dr. Kehyan Barzegar, who is joining us from Iran. His lecture will be followed by the question and answer session. With this brief introduction, I would request Executive Director IPI, Professor Sajjad Bukhari, to deliver his welcome remarks. Professor Sajjad Bukhari is the founder of the Islamabad Policy Institute. Over to you, sir.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dr. Kehyan Barzegar, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. With immense pleasure, I welcome all of you to today's lecture entitled Iran's Foreign Policy Outlook Under New Administration. I'm grateful to Dr. Kehyan for taking time out of his hectic schedule for today's webinar and enlighten us with his valuable insights. I appreciate my team for organizing this timely event as Iran's newly elected president, Sayyid Ibrahim Raisi, is taking oath of office today, the 5th August. It is important to take stock of his administration's foreign policy priorities, which will have far-reaching consequences for the regional peace and security. Ladies and gentlemen, President Raisi is assuming the office at a crucial juncture when Iran and the West are engaged in negotiation aimed at reviving the nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan for Action, JCPOA. When Biden administration took over, it was hoped that the United States would return to the nuclear deal with Iran. As President Joe Biden had repeatedly signaled that he would do so. This had generated hopes of peace and stability in the crisis-ridden Middle East. However, not much has been done so far. US was also expected to lift the unilateral sanctions in view of the COVID-19 that has badly affected Iran. During the campaign, President Raisi had emphasized that the oppressive sanction must be lifted and no effort should be spared in that regard. Ladies and gentlemen, similarly, the situation in Afghanistan, where a hasty withdrawal of US forces pushed the country into turmoil, will pose another immediate foreign policy challenge for the new government. Taliban forces have made huge territorial gains during the last 3 months. This has encouraged the insurgent groups posing grave security threats to the neighboring states, including Iran, Pakistan, and China. Meanwhile, the new Iranian administration will have to adapt to a new Middle East, where numerous Arab states have established their diplomatic relations with Israel, while some others are inclined to follow the same course. Likewise, the increasing engagement of China with the region through the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, can compel the new Iranian leadership to evaluate its policy approach towards the other regional countries. The role of Pakistan in the evolving regional politics cannot be ignored, as it too would be impacted by the developments in Afghanistan. In that direction, it would be important to analyze the repercussions on the relations between Iran and Pakistan in the wake of the protracted conflict in Afghanistan. Finally, it is also important to review the prospects of peace in the Middle East, which has been a breeding ground for conflicts for a few decades. Ladies and gentlemen, with this comes the focus of today's webinar, the foreign policy priorities of the newly elected administration in Iran. I look forward to hearing the insight of our esteemed speaker on this topic. I thank you again.
Thank you very much, Professor Sajjad Bukhari, for your welcome remarks. Now I would request our guest speaker, Dr. Kahyan Bazegar, who is Associate Professor of International Relations and Director at Center for Middle East, to deliver his insights on the issue. We are grateful to Dr. Kahyan for sparing time out of his busy schedule. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you, IPI, for inviting me to join you in this panel. I think, as the president of IPI mentioned, we are in a very crucial time, and I think in the context of Iran's policy, it's a historical moment. And I believe that new changes are coming, not only on the side of Iran's foreign policy, but also on the side of Iran's domestic politics that can complete each other. I organize my lecture in 3 sections. First, I would like to mention the model of Iran's foreign policy in the time of President Raisi. Second, I would like to put it and operationalize it in the policy issues. And third, I would like to mention the approaches of Iran's foreign policy and some prediction for the future. First of all, unlike some views, especially in the West and in some, regional countries, I believe that the government of President Raisi would not be a hardline government. I think being the president or the head of judiciary is different by being the president of Iran. When you become president, the key, issue is interaction with outside world. And with the situation that we are right now, in terms of domestic politics, economic expectations, anti-corruptions, the nation's demands for justice, and of course the issue of national unity. I think President Raisi cannot go towards a kind of hardline policy in domestic politics, and it is clear to me that he would like to establish a kind of political consensus inside the Iranian government so that he can, in a beneficiary way, conduct its moderate foreign policy. Of course, when I say moderate foreign policy, I mean more an active interaction foreign policy that I will explain. So this is, my understanding of domestic politics and discourses that will impact Iran's foreign policy. In terms of foreign policy, I think two elements are important. First of all, accumulated security will be the priority of the state of Iran. Second, I think internal wealth production, which is the demand of the Iranian people and nation. And I think in this regard, political reform will become a little bit as a matter of second priority. Of course, I believe that political development will transform to social development and will come and will be redefined by new concepts such as economic justice, anti-corruption measures, the equality of distribution of wealth, the strengthening of the right of women, and of course, implementing the second generation of Iran's revolution in the governmentship. That is very much important. But I believe that at the end of the day, the approaches of the model of Iran's foreign policy will be active interaction and based on a kind of progressive conservatism to somehow accumulate security and at the same time increase the national wealth by national production. From this perspective, I think we will withdraw from a kind of conservative, traditional conservative to a progressive conservative. And this kind of conservative has no choice to be combined by national elements. And Iran will use its national sources of power to combine, this kind of foreign policy. This is the model of foreign policy that I think President Raisi will follow. And that is the need of Iran in this crucial time that I explained. My second point is that how this foreign policy goes to policy issues. In this regard, I think three issues are important. First of all, a combination of geopolitical approaches and technological approaches is a must and inevitable, because in the terms of geopolitical approach, Iran is right now strong enough in the region and on the ground in the region, on the field, but that needs to be completed by technology and wealth, because no country can continue to be strong in a region without a great and wealthful, internal economy. That's why I think that President Raisi needs to also address this issue of technology and the issue and challenges of how to somehow increase national wealth and national production I think that is very much important. The most important issue of foreign policy, in my belief, will stay the issue of JCPOA, because that will somehow define the status of Iran in relations with great power and regional countries. And in this regard, I think if this happens, which I believe it will happen in a way, in a relative way, then we will see Iran to be more accommodative and more constructive in regional issues. Because when the sense of Iran's, insecurity, strategic insecurity is gone to some extent, then Iran, because of its geopolitical superiority, will naturally join any regional talks. Therefore, it is wrong for some Western countries to push on Iran to somehow cover the new JCPOA at the beginning by bringing extra issues of regional and missile issues. I think that's wrong, and I think that will kill the entire negotiation from the beginning. Naturally, regional talks is part of Iran's foreign policy, and Iran has always respected stability in the context of good relations with its neighborhood countries, and that is every country would do that. I think that is the policy of Pakistan, that's the policy of India, that's the policy of Turkey. All countries would like to see a stability in their sphere of influence, and I think Iran is not an exception. But the issue is that foreign presence and their threatening positions against Iran will bring a sense of insecurity, strategic insecurity for Iran, that leads Iran to be more active and present in the regional issues. If this sense of insecurity is removed, I am sure that Iran's foreign policy will be more accommodative at the sake of bringing more stability at the regional level. That is very much important. And I think, of course, in this context, the missiles program issue is irrelevant, because that is related to the deterrent strength of Iran, and no country would negotiate on that. My third point in the policy issue is that in the terms of subjective foreign policy, I think Iran will strengthen its relations with neighborhood countries in the context of economic integration and, of course, regional change of commodities instead of global change of commodities. That is very much important, because when we talk of globalization and interdependency, then the issue will become Western oriented. But when we develop a kind of regional multilateralism, that will be related to development and prosperity, which is important for the regional countries. Therefore, in this conceptual framework, I think strengthening relations with the neighborhood region will become the priority of foreign policy issues, and relations with the West will preserve some degree of tension, rather it is America or European countries, because with the all bad actions taken by Western countries on the issue of the JCPOA, by the US withdrawal from the nuclear deal, and undelivering of the European countries on their commitments on the nuclear deal, the issue of the West and even economic issues are becoming irrelevant and meaningless for the Iranian state and nation at the same time. And this trust is becoming even stronger by the day. And that will lead Iran to think to somehow expand its diplomacy. Here, I think Iran will follow a kind of balanced foreign policy in more tendency towards the neighborhood region and towards the East. Because when we talk of the East, East becomes more, combined with technology and prosperity, and the regional, transition of goods and, commodities. That is very much important. In all, I believe Iran's relations with Pakistan, India, China, Russia, Turkey, Iraq, and the countries of the Persian Gulf, the Arab countries of the Persian Gulf, will be enhanced, and Iran will prioritize its relations with these countries. That is very much important. And in the end, I think Iran will follow a balanced foreign policy. That does not mean that the Western countries will be, absent in Iran's new administration, but Iran will try to somehow its foreign policy in a balanced way, not in the traditional way of orienting towards the West that some technocrats inside Iran are in belief of. I think that will withdraw Iran from this, passive traditional foreign policy towards an active, progressive foreign policy when you try to balance your foreign policy in both the eastern side and the western side. That does not mean any ideological orientation, because when we talk of the East or the West, immediately we talk of ideological thinking, but that is not, my meaning is not ideological. My meaning is more developmental, how to manage your relations with the West and how to manage your relations with the East in a developmental manner. My third and last point goes to the approaches of Iran's foreign policy in terms of policy making. I think Iran will withdraw from, as I mentioned, from its traditional way of conducting foreign policy, which is somehow having some willing to conduct, and progress relations with the West and try to expand diplomacy for finding new friends in the greater West Asian region at the level of the states and at the same time at the level of the political movements. That is Iran's, active foreign policy to develop its relations with, both states and friendly forces in the region. Then it comes to an enhanced economic diplomacy or transit diplomacy. That is different from the traditional way of thinking about integration, that states need to somehow complete each other, selling oil and importing automobiles. No, I think that the new regionalization in Iranian foreign policy will be based on transitional and transit foreign policy, and that is to transit the chain of goods, because Iran is the hub and center of very important subsystems of the region. The Levant, it goes to the Central Asia and the Caucasus, Caspian Sea, Turkey, and by Turkey to Eastern Europe. Then it goes to the Persian Gulf and Arabian Peninsula, and most importantly, Afghanistan and South Africa, South Asia, which include Pakistan and India. By that to China. I think this will give Iran a great geopolitical, superiority in terms of transit diplomacy, and that is very much important. My last point is that this economic approach, which I call inward-looking approach, is important because President Raisi even himself mentioned that he would like to see a strong Iran. We have three discourses inside Iran. A strong Iran, which is based on geopolitical approach, a strong region, which is based on stability. But I synthesized these two approaches to say a strong Iran from inside. And that inward-looking approach means that Iran will be busy by strengthening its sources of power from inside. As I mentioned, accumulating security and increasing internal, wealth. That is the expectations of the Iranian people. And that is what I wanted to say. I stop now, and I thank you again for giving me the chance to share with you some of my views as an Iranian academic. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir, for your deep insights. You have raised many pertinent points and enlightened us on Iranian perspective. Now we will move on to question and answer session. We have received a number of questions from different participants. The first question we have received from our colleague from Islamabad Policy Institute. Mr. Ahmed, he asks, in the wake of Arab states' normalization of ties with Israel, is not the prospects of Iran complying with the nuclear agreement slim, specifically if the US refuses to remove the existing sanctions?
Well, Israel is quite understandably behind every, efforts on the US to sabotage any nuclear deal, no doubt. And I think this is becoming even more challenging when Iran's nuclear program is becoming more advanced. And that is the historical experience of the Israelis, because they have cheated in the decade of 1960 and 1970, that every nuclear program will become weaponized. But Iran's nuclear program is not in that direction. I think President Trump made a big mistake by opening the box, but by withdrawing from the nuclear deal. The Israelis are not ready or can afford even one person to see that situation. Therefore, they will conduct all the efforts to sabotage the advancement of Iran's nuclear program. And they are hoping that by pushing sanctions or triggering a war in the Persian Gulf or Sea of Oman, engage the US in confrontation with Iran. But Iran is ready, and it is saying that I will defend my position as Iran defended, the Trump's maximum pressure policy. I think the Iranian paid the price, and they will continue to go in that direction anyway.
Thank you very much, sir. Now moving towards the second question we have received from Mr. Usman from Quaid-e-Azam University. He asks about Afghanistan. He says, what foreign policy makers in new government would prefer to see in Afghanistan, the Islamic Emirate or the continuation of present republic system?
Well, of course, the Islamic Emirate is not the favorable policy, but the reality on the ground is different, as all countries are taking measures. The US some time ago in 2001 attacked the Taliban and somehow changed the government there, the Taliban regime. But now it is negotiating with the Taliban, because the reality on the ground is different. The Taliban has a government, it has heavy weapon, it has population, it has territory. So every country is trying to somehow manage its relations with the Taliban regime. Iran is not an exception, but I think Iran's foreign policy will be that to somehow preserve its interest in its eastern borders, especially the Herat zone is important for Iran. But I'm sure that Iran understands that Taliban is nothing itself. But Taliban, when it is becoming instrumental by other countries, outside countries, will become a challenge. I think Iran is trying to contain the Taliban, not taking actions against the Taliban. But if Iran's interests are endangered, I think Iran will take action at some point, especially when it goes to somehow some issues like, hijacking in Iranian eastern borders, or the smuggling of drugs, or, spreading anti-Iranian sentiment in Afghanistan, which brings a lot of damages to Iran's national interests, and a lot of other issues. I think these are important for Iran, but I'm sure that Iran is trying to somehow contain the Taliban by somehow talking with them, because it believes that it preserves Iran's national security right now.
Thank you very much, sir. The third question which we have received is how China's growing engagements in the region, including strategic partnership with Iran, can influence Iran-India relations.
Of course, that's two different issues. Iran-China relations is based on the idea of expansion of diplomacy. China is the source of technology for Iran, transfer of technology for Iran, and good relations with Iran, good friendship relations with Iran. I think there is a strategic logic for Iran to do that, but it is totally different from Iran's relations with India. I think Iran is trying to have good relations with both countries. Not only historically, Iran has been in good relations with both countries, culturally, socially, and most importantly, the significance and importance of geography, geographical attachment. Geography talks very well in foreign policy these days. There is a natural logic of the neighborhood, progress relations with these two powers. Therefore, in my belief, it is two separate issues. Iran will develop its relations with India and at the same time with China. And there is a logical expansion of diplomacy and transfer of technology, good labors, energy, and other things.
Thank you very much. We have received another question from Mr. Ali Ahmed from National Defense University. He asks, Iran has crucial stakes in Afghanistan, which requires coordination and engagement among all regional and international stakeholders. In this context, will new Iranian administration be willing to engage with US directly or even as part of a regional grouping comprising China, Pakistan, Central Asian states, Iran, and the US?
Of course, the first part is not, the interest of Iran to engage with the US directly. At some point, there is this say that Iran and the US cooperate in establishing the new Afghanistan in the Bonn Conference in 2001. But that was not a directed, cooperation. Iran and the US have a strategic, discrepancies in conducting the regional matters. So Iran will not go towards the US, but definitely will try to manage a regional kind of multilateral kind of diplomacy. And that includes, the neighborhood countries, no doubt. Therefore, it is in the interest of Iran first to follow its own national interest and have its own independent foreign policy by, a new initiative which matches with an emerging regional power. I think Iran should have its own independent and initiative, foreign policy towards Afghanistan. But in this context, I have no doubt that Iran will prefer to put it in a multilateral diplomacy. And the US is becoming irrelevant because the moment of the US is over in Afghanistan and they are going out. Of course, they will stay to preserve the political and security trends. That's the US style. But still, I think it is too much for them to stay in Afghanistan. Therefore, it's inevitable they withdraw their forces, but they will change their strategy to support the Afghan government. Regional countries should manage this, and I think Iran will go to that direction.
Thank you, Dr. Kayhan. We have another question by Mr. Umar from Quaid-e-Azam University. He asks, how does Iran look at deepening China-US competition and its impact on Gulf and Asian region?
Well, Iran has no expectation from China to somehow act in benefit of Iran at the expense of the US. I think Iran and China are developing their own bilateral relations. Unfortunately, the Chinese government is in the position to somehow accept this. Therefore, the issue of the US in the Iranian-China relations is irrelevant. The Chinese don't want to engage with that. They don't want to, confront the US because they need their relations with the US for their economic growth, at least for 10 years. And Iran at the same time has no expectation from China to battle for Iran at the expense of the US because it thinks that China would not do that. Therefore, in a realistic way, the US is irrelevant in Iran-China relations. And of course, China has been helpful and supportive for Iran on the nuclear deal and other issues. That goes to the Chinese new strategy of securing and bringing a stability in its geographical, near abroad by BRI or New Silk Road, that could Iran be at the hub of that. But again, I think China prefer to not, engage with the US in a geopolitical confrontation. It rather prefers to stay in the technological, relations. And that somehow justifies Iran-China relations in the equation of their relations with the American.
Thank you, sir. Now, this is the last question from Ms. Amina from Islamic University. She asked, how does foreign policy makers in Iran look at Pakistan's present role in Afghanistan? Is it possible that Iran will back trilateral Pakistan, India, Afghanistan talks for regional peace and security?
I think Iran accepts and recognizes that Pakistan has vital interest in Afghanistan. That is something that I feel that the Iranian policymakers understand well for several reasons. Therefore, when it goes to India and Pakistan, Iran is careful to not intervene in that relations because that is a special equation between Pakistan and India in Afghanistan. Here, I think Iran will try to follow a kind of positive neutrality in the context of preserving its own national interest. Pakistan is an Islamic country, is a good neighboring countries. Your president right now is in Tehran in our president inauguration ceremony, which shows a great, deal of respect for the Iranian. And Pakistan has always taken a kind of balancing action and foreign policy in the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I believe that Pakistan will not act against Iran at the benefit of third party. Therefore, Iran and Pakistan relations will stay friendly based on historical determination and geographical attachment. And they should not let, the Taliban issue bring, that much challenges in these very historical bilateral good relations. They need to manage their relations in dealing with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kayhan Bazigar, for your comprehensive remarks and deep insights on different important issues concerning Iranian foreign policy priorities under the new administration of President Ibrahim Raisi. You have brilliantly enlightened us about numerous aspects of expected changing regional developments in the coming days. It was an interesting session, I believe, and we are grateful to you again for sparing time and joining us despite having busy hours. And I think we have discussed all important points of the agenda. I am again grateful to all the participants. Thank you very much.
I thank you also for inviting me again. Thank you.
Thank you very
Goodbye.
much.
Goodbye.